chapter, we are going to be studying unemployment taxes. But as I explained earlier, because we have a whole section devoted to Montana, we're not going to spend a whole ton of time on SUTA in this chapter because we're going to do that when we get the Montana text. But I'll certainly introduce it and talk about some basics that are the same all over the country. But we're going to dial into Montana, the reports and the deposit requirements and everything when we get into that section. So unemployment taxes, this is kind of a flashback to the first week of school where we were learning about all the pieces of legislation that passed. This was passed as part of the whole Social Security Act, 1935. And prior to 1935, if you became unemployed in the United States, that just kind of sucked for you. There was nowhere that you went to get payments. You just, had to kind of figure it out. So this was the first, so that's, what is that, 80 years old, I guess, 82 years old, that we actually have an unemployment program in our country. It's a federal law, and it imposes a tax on the employers. Now, food is always only the employer. In Montana, SUTA is only the employer. But in some states, employees pay into SUTA too. And I think you're seeing that on your, what the heck's that called? Comprehensive problem at the back of each chapter. You're doing that manual payroll register, right? I should probably prompt you on that. Is everybody working on that as you go to? That's every chapter, right? In this chapter, you'll see when you complete that in Pennsylvania, which is where the company is, there's actually a SUTA tax that's paid for in part by the employees. So just be aware of that. And SUTA is very different in every state. Some states, both employee and employer pay. Some states, the cap is like 35 grand. Some states, it's 8. Some states, you can get up to $600 a week in unemployment payments. I think Montana is I don't know, maximum's like 420 or something. Does anyone know that number? So it's just different state by state depending upon the financial situation of the individual state. Okay, pretty much everybody pays FUTA. This is the specifics of the law. If you pay anybody $1,500 or more of wages in any quarter in this year or the last year, then you're liable for FUTA. Or if somebody works even one day for you in each of 20 weeks this year or last year, you got to pay FUTA. And there are specific rules for both domestic help and agricultural employees. And it's really everybody. It's part-time, full-time, ag employees, household employees. You really have to pay FUTA on almost every category of employee. This is just some specifics. This screen is important because as we've seen with FICA and FIT, and now we're on FUTA, our third F tax, there's specific exceptions to the tax. And this is like a laundry list of folks that are specifically excluded. And so this is worth going through. So if you have a partnership, like let's say Karsten and I are we have a silversmith business together, and we're partners. Okay, we don't have an S corp, we don't have an LLC. We're partners in the partnership. We are specifically excluded from paying FUTA on ourselves. Because in a partnership, you don't take a wage from it, you take something called a guaranteed payment, and that's just treated differently under tax law. So if you're a partner in a partnership, no FUTA. If you're a director, which means you sit on the board of directors. Okay, if you sit on the board of directors of a company and you advise them, no FUTA. You well know that if you're an independent contractor, I don't have to pay taxes on you. You have to pay taxes on yourself, right? Home workers. So that's if I have a business that I don't know, assembles something or stuffs envelopes and y'all work at home. You come to the headquarters and you pick up all the stuff and you go home and you work and you get paid by the piece. I don't have to pay food on you. Full-time life insurance, salespeople, kids under 21, if you recall, also they are exempted from FICA. So if I've got a business and I've got my kids working for me and they're under 21, I'm not having to pay FICA on them, I'm not having to pay food on them. Our RTA is Railroad Transit Authority, I think. So this was set up back in the 20s, or anybody that works for the government, no FUTA. And then there's a whole list on pages 5.3 and 5.4. Okay, and then basically we're kind of now segueing over to SUTA. Who's covered under SUTA? You're covered under SUTA if you're covered under FUTA. So there's almost no examples, I guess nothing jumps to my head immediately, of where you would be covered under one but not the other. The question under around SUTA is to guarantee, again, if I'm going to pay unemployment on you, and then you can claim against my number, right, my EIN, which impacts my rates, I want to make all darn sure that you're actually an employee. So this is called the ABC test. You've seen it before. All it is are they an independent contractor or an employee, right? Are they free from control? Is the work performed outside the usual course of business? Is the person normally engaged in an independent trade or business? If all of those tests are met, that means you're independent, and I'm not going to pay suit on you. Okay, this gets kind of interesting. So does anyone know what an interstate employee is? Yeah, it's like I'm an employer and I've got employees that either travel between states or I've just got employees that are in different states. And I mean, that happens in Montana a lot. Like in Western Montana, you'll see a lot of like crossover into Idaho. Eastern Montana, you see a lot of crossover into North Dakota. And so it's a really big deal if you're an employer, because you don't really want to pay SUTA to two states. You don't want to do two sets of reports. You don't want to have to worry about complying with the laws in two states. So basically what this says is sometimes there's a question that arises as to what state am I liable as an employer to pay the SUTA to. So here's the order that you have to evaluate where you pay. So the first thing you have to do is say, where is the work actually happening? And an example that I have that I went through a long time ago, but doesn't matter, was a trucker. He was a log liner. And he pulled logs out of the forest in eastern Idaho and western Montana. So where's the work localized? That didn't give us an answer because his log liners had contracts in both states. Okay. So you go to the second bullet. Where is the operational base located? Well, they had somebody down in, the name of the little town escapes me now, outside of Salmon somewhere, doesn't matter. But they had somebody that was running the log liner contracts there, and then they had somebody out of Darby that was running the log liners here. So I still couldn't look at that one and say, okay, that's the operational base was dispersed as well. So then I went on to the third one, where are the operations directed? And that's what gave me my answer, because our headquarters were here in Darby. The owner lived in Darby. He bid all the contracts out in Darby. You know, the home base for the entire operation was in Darby. So for me, that I felt confident that I could pay SUTA to Montana and still cover the men and women that were working in Idaho and feel safe that I had chosen the right state. So these are the steps that you have to go in. Okay? And if you need guidance at any point in time, you can also call the Department of Labor and Industry and say, here's my situation and I'm not really knowing what to do, and you know, please give me some guidance.
What's the difference between the second and third?
So it was the example of they had operational bases in both states where they were actually dispersing the log liners and bringing the logs back and getting them to the mills. but where were the contracts written? Where was the client relations conducted? That was all, where were they directed? In other words, who was bidding the contracts and saying, hey, you go log over there and he's going to log over there. And that all happened out of Darby.
All the way down to number 4.
Yeah.
I mean, that's the whole question, isn't it? Well, in this
Right.
example anyway, it's,
Yeah.
there's employees in both places.
Right.
So then it's pretty much call
Right.
up and see what they say.
Yeah, pretty much. You're hoping to get an answer before you get to number 4, because what you're really hoping to not have to do is pay SUTA to multiple states. Because then you've got to learn the laws everywhere. And you've got to set up the different caps in your software to stop paying SUTA when you reach 20,000 in Idaho, but she's got to get all the way to 35 in Montana. I mean, it's just, it leaves more room for error. So if on that prior slide that we just looked at that had those 4 bullet points, if I go through that whole thing and I'm still like, I have no frickin' idea what to do, you can, and some states will, enter into this is a mouthful, but interstate reciprocal coverage arrangement. And that is when you can, when your state will work with you as an employer and you can just ask them to cover all your employees in one state. Okay? Why would Montana not want to do that if there was no answer on the prior slide? It's just more liability and more work for them, right? Who wants to have, another, 2,800 people that you got to worry about maybe paying out unemployment to, okay? So some states will do it, some states won't. Montana did it. They started doing it actually when there was the big boom on the Bakken, whatever that started, 07, 08, 09, somewhere in there. There was a lot of interstate reciprocal agreements because people didn't, small players and drillers and pads didn't want to be paid to both states. So that's a benefit. The employer gets to pay where they want, gets to choose where they want to pay. And they're going to choose the one that has the most advantageous wage base. And just be aware that in these slides and in the book, what they call wage base, I call a cap. Okay, so up to what amount? What was our cap for FUTA again? For FUTA. I think that was 7,000, wasn't it, FUTA? Might want to go back and review your little matrix from the first day or your first week. And then the cap for SUTA, somebody actually has to remind me, it changes every year. 31,400. Is it 31.4? Okay. So that goes up. It's indexed for inflation every year. The legislature, every other year when the legislature meets, they index it for inflation. So the first 31,400 that I pay each of you, I'm going to pay SUTA on. The first 7,000 I pay each of you is my wage base for FUTA. Okay, so they're not the same thing. What's kind of confusing when you look at the book and look at the table of what each state's wage base is, some states have a wage base that's the same as FUTA. In other words, they only pay their SUTA up to 7,000 of wages. But don't get confused, it's not the same thing, it just happens to be in that state. We have a pretty high wage base here in Montana. Oops. Okay, so I'm not going to go through this right this moment, or I'm not going to open the book, but you should look at it. Well, you'll actually have to look at it because some of your homework requires you to do that. So there's a different wage base for each state, and it's on pages 512 and 513, and it's kind of worth, taking a perusal over, like who's really high, who's really low, and then it also shows the high and low contribution rates. And again, you might want to write this down because this verbiage is kind of all over the place. A contribution rate is for SUTA, what they call it, what a tax is. Okay, so your contribution rate is 3.8%. That means your SUTA tax rate is 3.8%. No idea why they call it a contribution rate. To me, that feels voluntary, right? So SUTA tax, contribution rate, interchangeable terms. And also, it's not just your regular wages that are included, but all these other things. Severance pay, bonuses, stock comp, tips, retroactive wage increases. And again, on page 5-7 is the full list of everything that you have to put into the calculation to pay SUDA and FUTA. FUTA, the people cap pretty darn quick, but SUDA, you might have some differential here with these different items added. What kinds of things don't you pay FUTA on? You don't pay it if you are being reimbursed for business travel. So I go travel, I give my employer my expense report, and he or she cuts me a check for $1,500. That's not taxable. I'm not going to have to pay. They're not going to have to pay FUTA or SUTA on that. Neither retirement pay, tuition assistance, strike benefits, and you can, again, full laundry list. So when I refer you to these full laundry lists, certainly nobody's expecting you to memorize the laundry list, but it's good to there's so much in tax law and payroll tax law, it's good to just go peruse those. And that happens to me all the time. Somebody will come in, trying to think what the good example is recently. Somebody will come in and say, I donated, here's a good example, I donated my old car to the battered women's shelter last year. And I don't really know the rules, but because I've looked at the list of charitable contributions, I know there's some weird exception to cars, planes, and boats. So I can go look it up. That's why we look at those lists, right? It's not that you remember everything. For God's sake, nobody can do that. But it just spurs you oh, I have to go look that up. That's special. So I've given you 3 lists to just take a peek at today, right? The exempt from FUTA, the exempt wages, exempt people, and then the SUTA caps and rates in the different states. So, okay, this is kind of interesting. Interesting slash convoluted. Okay, so first off, your question should be, oh my goodness, I didn't think FUTA was 6.0. I thought it was 0.6. Is that your first question? Yes. Good question. So, I never honestly even knew this until I started teaching. Because in the real world, I have never seen a FUTA rate be anything other than 0.6. So what the heck do I mean? This is the gross FUTA rate. In other words, this is what you start with. But then you get a credit. And the credit is 5.4%. And that's called your SUTA credit. Which obviously then leaves you this, right? For your net FUTA. But here's what the confusing part is. Does everybody have a 5.4% SUTA rate? No. You could have a 1.2% rate or a 5.9% rate or a 4.0% rate, right? But that doesn't matter. Everybody gets this SUTA credit, which takes you down to 0.6. There's only 2 things that can muck that up, and I'll show you what those are in a second. In other words, there's only 2 things that can change this number, the net FUTA, and those are both directly tied into the fact that this credit changes in the 2 situations I'm going to describe. So if the SUTA credit goes down, the net FUTA rate mathematically goes up, right? So the question is, what are those things that can change? Okay, so that's just what I wrote on the board, 5.4% credit against FUTA, even if your experience rating or your contribution rate is Anything else other than 5.4, that's still what you get. That's what I just basically wrote on the board. The thing that's funny, or not funny, haha, but just interesting, is that on the 940 and on the reports and when everybody talks about FUTA, all you ever see is the 0.6. Like I said, I didn't even know this formula was above it when I was in the actual work world. But it's reared its ugly head. During the Great Recession, there were a lot of shifts that I'll explain in a second that did change the SUTA credit for a whole lot of people, a whole lot of employers. And for the first time, I did see numbers other than 0.6. So let me show you. Okay, so first off, this one's really easy. To get the full 5.4% SUTA credit, an employer must have made their SUTA contributions on a timely basis on or before the date for filing. So when I go to do my 940 for FUTA, one of the questions it's going to ask me is, did you pay all your SUTA payments on time for your state? And if I didn't, that will impact that 5.4% credit. Okay, so, and I'm not going to go into the details of that. It depends upon how many payments were late and how late they were and da-da-da-da-da. But it's going to impact that. It's going to make your credit go down, therefore it's going to make your net FUTA rate go up. The second situation, let me explain this and then I'll read it to you. It's easier to kind of explain it than to get it off of here. So the second situation is if you are an employer in a state like, I think there was 12 states this happened in during the Great Recession, that they basically their unemployment compensation fund went bankrupt, right? Like, what were some states that were really impacted in 08? Huh? Anybody?
Detroit was.
Michigan was a state that went broke. What else? Arizona, California, Nevada, Florida. I mean, there was 12 of them. Ohio, Indiana. We didn't, because we have a mandated balanced budget, right? But 12 states, they had so much unemployment. Everybody was claiming unemployment. Lots of businesses were shutting down, so there wasn't much tax money going into the system. They just ran out of money. So say you guys are all, in Michigan, and you're like, I'm like, oh, sorry. I know that you're out of a job and you're trying to live on a third of what you used to live on anyways, but we're broke. We can't cut you an unemployment check anymore. Okay, that's what happened. In that situation, the Title 12 Act kicks in. And what that says is the state can go to the feds and borrow money to pay their unemployment, right? So these 12 states had to go do that. You go to the federal government, hey, it's not so much borrowing money as printing money, but okay. So now I can pay you your checks. And then the federal government gives me, i.e. Michigan or Arizona, 2 years to start paying the money back, right? And they're big chunks of money, billions of dollars in some cases. Well, if my economy hasn't jump-started within a couple years, I still don't have the money to pay it back. So then I become in Title 12 default. The whole state is in Title 12 default. And every single employer in the state starts to lose their SUTA credit by 0.3% for every year they're in default. Okay. So Michigan borrowed Title 12 funds in 2009. So they would have had to have started paying them back by 2011. You have 2 years. Well, they didn't. So in 2012, every single employer in Michigan, their SUTA credit went down by 0.3%. So now their net FUTA rate is 0.9. Okay. Then in 2013, Michigan still didn't have money to start paying them back. So then their credit went down to 4.8%. And this guy goes up to 1.2%, and so on and so forth. So you can see, all of a sudden, like I said, I'd never seen it before. I got out of undergrad in 1985, And I've never seen anything other than 0.6. So all of a sudden, you saw a lot of it. Anytime you dealt with anybody in one of those 12 states, right, that's what the situation was. So their FUTA went up. Everyone see that? Now, just so that you know, when we do the 940s on Friday, when this is happening, this impaired SUTA credit, you have to put an attachment to the 940 called a Schedule B. And that just shows how impaired your SUTA credit is and what your rate is. Montana was never there. We never borrowed Title 12 funds. We never went broke. It's not a situation here. But again, when you deal with employers in other states, it is.
You said that the schedule B just basically explains.
Which
how much
state?
they're paying.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, okay.
There's still 2 that are still in default.
Really?
Uh-huh. And I wish I could tell you that off the top of my head. I'm thinking Cali is one of them. Okay. SUTA laws. Okay, and I should probably, so there's, so the way that they calculate, the way that a state, any state, but I'll just use Montana for example because we're here, the way that the state of Montana calculates your particular SUTA rate, and here's another interchangeable term you should put down in your notes. Make sure you can have all these together because this verbiage is so scattered. So a rate, your employer's rate is the same as your SUTA rate is the same as your contribution rate. What else did I use give you interchangeable terms? Oh, wage base and cap are the same thing. So an experience rating is something different. We're going to talk about that now. An experience rating is based upon their analysis. Let's see, where is that? I'm going to kind of jump ahead and then I'll go back. An experience rating is based upon the state's analysis of what your employment situation has looked like. So, for example, if I'm a small professional firm, God bless, of like, say, dentists or hydrologists, and it's the same 8 people have been working together since 1985, we have no turnover, I'm going to have a really, really low SUTA rate because there's very little risk they're ever going to have to pay out unemployment. Okay? If I'm in an industry like construction or fast food or firefighting, those are really different industries, but that either have a lot of turnover or have down periods where people are just unemployed as a course of the cycles, right? Like in Montana, if you work in outdoor construction, you're probably off work 3-4 months a year, right? So if that's the kind of industry that you work in, you're going to have a higher experience rating. So an experience rating reflects what's happened in your past. And that's all done, it's all modeled, it's all done in the computer. They spit out a rate, and here you go. But here's what's in the model. Low turnover, obviously you're going to have a lower rate. How much reserves do you have built up? And for any of you that have ever had like a little ding on your car or a couple parking or tickets, vehicle tickets in a year, what does that do to your insurance? Okay, it skyrockets it up way past anything that could possibly ever have been in your reserve. And that's exactly what happens. You have no accident for 18 years, right? I mean, they've got a whole shit ton of your money in my mind, right? And then you have like two vehicular tickets and your premiums double, right? So that's sort of the model that happens here. You can build up a reserve for a lot of years and have really good performance and no turnover and no claims. And if you go through like a layoff cycle where you go from 3 shifts a day to 2 shifts a day or something, and you have some pretty significant claims, those reserves disappear pretty quickly in the calculation. And then the last two bullets, those are also terms you need to know, a positive balance employer and a negative balance employer. And a positive balance employer is somebody that has paid in more money than they've paid out in claims. So right at that point in time, you have a surplus, just like the example I gave you with the car. In the negative balance is I've paid in less than I've paid out, and you can be guaranteed your SUTA rate's going to go up, probably significantly, to get you up to a positive balance. So I don't know if any of you are ever aware of a situation or been in one yourself or know somebody where an employer will say, try and fight your unemployment claim. Right? Are they doing that just to be, ugly people? No, because even one claim can affect their SUTA rate, and then that's the rate I pay on all 40 of my employees. So it really is, it's a whole bunch more than just paying you out a, check for $300 a month. It's going to impact my rate sometimes for years, and it can be a big, big hit. Okay, this we're not going to worry about right now. All right. Let's see, let me do this real quick. Okay, so Form 940. So calculating, let me just back up a sec. So FUTA is an employer-only tax, right? So does that have anything to do with your paychecks? Does that show up on any of your paychecks in any way? No, but do I need to calculate the liability for it with every time I run payroll? I do, and when we've been doing our CLGL, what are the two payroll journal entries that I make? The first one is to do what? Yeah, run the payroll, right? Is there food on that one? No. The second journal entry is to do what? Yeah, the employer taxes. And that's FUTA, SUTA, OESDI, and HI. Okay? So I'm going to use accounting speak here, but I'm accruing a FUTA liability every time I run payroll, right? But FUTA is such a small tax that they don't worry about me depositing it every single time, right? So what they do worry about is that I have to report it once a year and make sure that I've somehow gotten even. So how do I report it? I report it on a Form 940. Now, let's just do some comparison and contrasting. Form 941. What do I report on my Form 941?
Quarterly contributions to the employees.
So what taxes?
Income tax.
FICA,
FICA.
FICA, FIT, right?
Yes.
FICA, FIT. How often does the 941 go in? Quarterly, right? I've got to file it quarterly. How often do I have to make my 941 deposits? Very good answer. The answer is always two words. It depends. They'll tell you you're one of two types of depositors. And then there's an exception if you're really big. There's an exception if you're really small. With a 940, how many times a year does it go in? Once. It's due by January 31st, which is also the same day I have to send in all my whats.
The W-2s and the last quarter of the benefit.
Yeah. I got to get in all my W-2s, my W-3, my 1099s, my 1096, my last 941, and this guy. All are due on January 31st. Okay. Let's see, what else do I have to say there? Nothing.
And just a side question.
Sure.
They're all electronic now, so if you just theoretically, if you were a business and you were hitting that button on January 30th, they would all get that by 31st, right?
Oh, sure.
So you basically got that entire month to work those.
Oh, yeah. Some are still paper. Some people still file paper forms. It has to be posted. No. It has to be received by. Has to be received by. It was so interesting. Last night we're watching this new Netflix called Good Girls Revolt. And it's about women in the 60s in the workplace. It's kind of like a Mad Men that are coming of age and getting their professional feet underneath them. It's also set in New York. And it was really an interesting historical thing because they were called letter carriers before they were called mailmen. There was a letter carrier strike. And it was a national tragedy. The National Guard was called in to deliver mail. People weren't getting their pension checks. It was during the Vietnam War. People weren't hearing about, getting letters from their kids, Social Security checks. Everything went through them. It was the National Guard was called in to deliver mail. Nixon came on. I don't know. I just thought that was extraordinary just to show in that short of a time period. We go to our mailbox like every third day, and it's like 99.9% recycling. There's never, anyways, it's just interesting how much it has changed. But it does have to be received by to answer your question. Okay, if you need an extension of time, you can be granted an extension of time. I don't know why you would need that other than your payroll might be in disarray. If you've screwed something up and you need to go back and refile it, there's a little box that says amended, so you can amend it. And you also have to remember, even in the year when say that your business is done being in business, that you have to file a final return and check the box that says this is my final year. Otherwise, they'll keep excitedly wondering why you're not filing tax returns anymore. You have to tell them I'm done, cease doing business. Okay, so I am going to cut off here. So bring your 940s, please, on Friday, and